March 22nd happens to be the birthday of two of Broadway's biggest legends, the composers Stephen Sondheim and Andrew Lloyd Webber. While Sondheim and Lloyd Webber were always supportive of each other's careers and even collaborated on a Cameron Mackintosh birthday song mashing up their most famous hits, it's common in the musical theater community to hear that you have to pick one. I think this is absurd. Many of my favorite musicals were written by one of these two composers or the other. As such, I like to treat March 22nd as sort of musical theater holiday, where I watch a double feature of their shows, watching one Sondheim and one Lloyd Webber show. While I was deciding which show I should watch for each, I thought it would be fun to walk through their careers and discuss some of their shows. I'm not going to hit every show that each of them wrote, but I will talk about more than half of each composer's extensive repertoire. Let's start with the Sondheim show. Saturday Night was Sondheim's first professional musical. This is a musical that you probably only know if you're not only a really big musical theater fan, but also a really big Sondheim fan. It was supposed to run on Broadway in the fall of 1955, but the producer died in August, and so the performance was canceled, which I can only imagine was devastating for Sondheim, having his big Broadway debut canceled like that. But he did make his debut, of course, 2 years later. Saturday Night is an interesting look into early Sondheim musical theater writing. We see glimpses of how Sondheim was beginning to develop the techniques that he would use throughout his career, such as writing accents into lyrics. In the opening number, Saturday Night, he rhymes hit you with picture, hit ya with pitcha, which is an interesting way of demonstrating how the characters are supposed to talk in their New York accents. My favorite song from Saturday Night is What More Do I Need? I saw Sierra Boggess perform a wonderful rendition of that song last year at the Hollywood Bowl. Moving on to Andrew Lloyd Webber, the first musical of his that I'm going to talk about is Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, which he wrote with Tim Rice as the lyricist. And Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat is a really fun musical. It's a very campy show. The music is sort of all over the place in terms of genre. You get country songs, you get this faux French kind of song. You get a mix of everything, and it's a really fun show. My favorite song from that is Pharaoh's Story, although really anything that the narrator sings is great. Jumping back to Sondheim did make his Broadway debut in 1957 with West Side Story, which is a remarkable show to debut with, considering it is one of the most influential shows in the history of musical theater. One thing I want to talk about with West Side Story is the song I Feel Pretty. It's a song that I actually hated for a very long time. I thought it was a very annoying song. But then the 2021 movie came out, and Rachel Zegler just does a fantastic job singing that song. And so I started listening to that song a lot more often, which meant I started analyzing the song a lot more often, thinking about it more. It's actually a really interesting song in terms of lyrics. Actually, Sondheim didn't like this song because of the lyrics, for the same reason that I do like it, in the sense that it is, as he said, it was an instance of the lyricist trying to show off his cleverness as opposed to properly developing the character's voice. Which is a really interesting point, and I think that that's a very good thing to consider if you're writing musical theater lyrics. So he had, for example, internal rhyme, like in the line, "It's alarming how charming I feel." And he said in his book, Finishing the Hat, that a character like Maria, who speaks English as a second language and is growing up on, hearing the street argot of New York, she's probably not going to have a very sophisticated speech style in English. She's going to speak much more straightforwardly. Sondheim felt that wasn't adequately represented in the rhymes, which was, again, a really interesting point. In I Feel Pretty, you still see another example of writing accents into lyrics. This is actually one of my favorite examples because nobody ever gets it right when they sing it, except for in the original Broadway cast album, where I have no doubt that Sondheim was hovering over them, making sure they sang it right. Have You Met My Good Friend Maria, which is supposed to rhyme with you'll know her the minute you see her. Maria and see her, Maria Sia, which is a really interesting rhyme attempt because you can see Sondheim's thought process here in that many dialects of Spanish do not have H sounds. And if you don't have an H sound in your native language, that is a remarkably challenging sound to learn how to say. And then also you have this rhotic vowel, right, this R-colored vowel, which also doesn't exist in Spanish. And so these are sounds that would be very difficult to say for a native Spanish speaker, especially one who's been exposed strictly to New York English, where you get a lot of R dropping. And so it was really interesting to see how he constructed this rhyme here. Whether or not it's an accurate rhyme for that accent, just interesting to see where he was coming from with that. My favorite song from West Side Story is probably Maria, or maybe Tonight, although it's one of the best scores in musical theater, so there really isn't a bad song in there. The next Andrew Lloyd Webber show I'm going to talk about is Jesus Christ Superstar, which is a secular retelling of a biblical story. This was written again with Tim Rice as the lyricist, and it's a really interesting show. It was very controversial because it doesn't portray a resurrection, it just portrays Jesus' death. That was very controversial in the 70s when it first came out. But it's just interesting because, for one, it depicts Jesus as more of a man than a god, and it focuses more on the effects of sort of the fanaticism of his followers than it does on anything about him having actual godlike powers. It's a really audacious musical in the sense that it questions whether Judas was actually evil or whether he was just obedient, following the rules that God wanted him to follow in turning Jesus in. So that's a really interesting perspective that you see on this story. The best song from Jesus Christ Superstar, in my opinion, is either Heaven on Their Minds or This Jesus Must Die. After West Side Story, Sondheim wrote the lyrics for a musical called Gypsy, which was a very popular musical at that time, and it's been revived, I believe, 5 times, so it remains a pretty popular musical. Sondheim didn't invent the term "everything's coming up roses," but he absolutely popularized it. And Rose's Turn is like the quintessential 11 o'clock number. It is a really fascinating number of how it calls back all of these details from Act 1 that you realize are still weighing on Rose as she's going into this sort of mental breakdown, and just watching her really break down and admit, not just to the audience, but really to herself, why she's been doing all the stuff that she's been doing, what the real purpose was for it, and that it is self-serving, not so much to promote her daughters. So it's just a really fantastic 11 o'clock number. And then Gypsy has what I think is the best song and reprise combination of any musical in the history of Broadway, which is Let Me Entertain You. It starts off as such an annoying little song that's just really easy to forget about, and then it just comes back as a reprise in the most haunting way. I'm not going to really say too much detail about how it changes, because I think that if you don't know what Gypsy is about, it's a really good one to watch blind, not knowing anything about it, and that twist is just really fantastic. That said, while I've praised 3 songs already, my favorite song is actually All I Need Is the Girl. Evita is the next Andrew Lloyd Webber show that I'm going to talk about. Patti LuPone famously says in her memoir that her first thought when she heard the Evita soundtrack or album or whatever you wish to call it, that Andrew Lloyd Webber hates women. This is because of the insanely difficult vocal part that is the lead role, where it is this massive range and you're just jumping from the low parts of it to the high parts of it all over the place. It is a very challenging role, which makes it really fascinating to listen to. It is a huge range, of course, except for in the movie where that got really tightened up. The movie is a very controversial movie because of that. I actually really love the movie. It's one of my favorite movie musicals, which, again, not a very popular opinion. But I do like the movie, especially Antonio Banderas' portrayal of Che. Speaking of Che is often erroneously believed to be Che Guevara. He's not. He's based on him. But Che is actually a stand-in for the people of the lower class, which were the people that Eva Peron and her husband were targeting in their ascent for power. And what's really interesting about Che is his name. Interesting to me, anyway. So there is a indigenous people of Argentina called the Mapuche. And this term Mapuche translates from the Mapuche as land of the people. Mapu is land, and Che is people. So it's just really coincidentally fitting that this character, who's a stand-in for the people of Argentina, has a name that is an Argentinian word for people. I just really love that detail. I don't think it was at all intentional. Evita is where we really start to see the allegations of plagiarism against Andrew Lloyd Webber, specifically self-plagiarism. I like to think of these as fun little Easter eggs to find, because it's like callbacks to Jesus Christ Superstar and Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. I think it's kind of fun to see those, to hear those callbacks and the references. My favorite song from Evita is probably Oh What a Circus, which is Che's first song. The next Sondheim show I'm going to talk about is A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. This is the first Broadway show that Sondheim wrote both the music and the lyrics for. It is based on the style, it's a very specific style of play, which is based on the Roman playwright Plautus, the way that he wrote plays. He wrote comedies. Actually, Plautus's shows are the oldest complete works of Roman literature that we have, which is cool. And so it's really interesting that Sondheim decided to try and emulate his style for his show. So that means that Forum is a farce. It has themes like having a clever slave who's the driving point of the show. There's father-son relationships and stuff like that. Forum is not my favorite Sondheim show. It's probably my least favorite Sondheim show. I think the humor just didn't really stick with me. I do appreciate the way that he was aiming to recreate that kind of show, but it's just not the type of show that I particularly like. And I don't really have a favorite song from A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. Cats is the next Andrew Lloyd Webber show that I'm going to talk about. Just like Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, the music is sort of all over the place in terms of genre. You get a wide variety of musical style in Cats. I like to call Cats a rock ballet, right? Because we have this term rock opera for these melodramatic sung-through musicals that are heavily rock-inspired. And Cats is also rock-inspired, but it's also sung-through. But it's, calling it a rock ballet just works because it really emphasizes the fact that the dance is supposed to be what you get out of this. That is the primary focus of the show, is the dancing. And I think that that's why a lot of people dislike Cats, is they expect it to be different from what it is. Cats is one of those shows that knows exactly what it wants to be, and it does it fantastically. And what it wants to be is a rock ballet. If you know what you're getting into, if you know you're here to experience some fantastic dancing with some goofy music, it's a really fun experience live. My favorite song from Cats is Skimbleshanks the Railway Cat. That's a really fun song. The next Sondheim show I'm going to talk about is Company. This may be my favorite musical of all time. But Company is a really interesting show because it asks questions about relationships that are generally assumed in other media. Questions like, why bother having a relationship? How do you know that you're ready for a relationship? Stuff like that. When I first saw Company a few years ago as one of my Sondheim birthday viewings, I remember thinking that this is such a cynical show when it comes to marriage. It's really fascinating to see how Bobby goes from being the observer of all these interactions with married people, and how cynical the show is about marriage, and yet Bobby still comes out the other side deciding this is what he wants. My favorite song from Company is Marry Me a Little. I think that it is a fantastic first act closer, that paired with Being Alive as the second act finale. Those just demonstrate really fantastic character development for Bobby. Phantom of the Opera is the next Andrew Lloyd Webber show I'm going to talk about. One of my favorite Lloyd Webber shows, possibly my favorite. I really love the music from this show. It's a musical that I think is, I think it gets kind of a bad rap these days, in the sense that a lot of people, I think, a lot of people criticize it for being a sort of love triangle kind of show, when it really isn't supposed to be that. It is clearly an abusive relationship between Phantom and Christine. It's not a romantic one. And if you look at especially earlier productions of the show before like 2010, you really see that a lot more. It doesn't help that after 2010 or so, Raoul started changing in his portrayal, where he becomes a much colder character. And this is because of the sequel for Phantom that came out around that time, which we'll get to in a few minutes. Another controversial opinion is that my preferred viewing method, other than obviously seeing it live in a theater, is watching the movie. I prefer that to the pro shot, or listening to the original Broadway cast album. I actually really love the movie. It's a very beautiful movie cinematographically, I think. You know, and I love how they filmed it in the Palais Garnier, where the show takes place, and quite frankly, I like the cast too. My favorite song from Phantom of the Opera is either Music of the Night or Wishing You Were Somehow Here Again. Although again, with Phantom of the Opera, I think it's got a really fantastic score. There's no bad songs in the bunch. The next Sondheim show I'm going to talk about is Follies. This is one that has a lot of really great songs, although I find the plot a little boring. It's a very reflective plot. And you know, it's where you have these people who are looking back over the last 30 years and trying to see where their lives went wrong, why they're unhappy now. There's some really fantastic rhymes in Follies, especially actually there's a song that's been cut, it's called Ah, But Underneath, has some really great rhymes. And then in the opening number you get Celestial and Bestial and stuff like that. My favorite song from Follies is Losing My Mind, especially when Michael Ball sings it, even though it's a song that's meant to be sung by a woman. Aspects of Love is the next Andrew Lloyd Webber show that I'm going to talk about, and this is a very weird show. It is creepy and weird, and it's my least favorite show that I'm going to talk about today. It's a weird show in the sense that you have weird love triangles going on between this guy and this girl and the guy's uncle, which is a weird start. And then later, the uncle and the girl, they get married and have a kid. And then later on, 14 or 17 years later, that kid starts being romantically interested in the guy, which is really concerning and inappropriate. It's a weird show. It's very soap opera-ish. It definitely feels like a soap opera. And in my opinion, there's only like one really good song in it, which is actually the opening number, Love Changes Everything. I'm not a fan of how the dialogue is sung in this one. And I'll talk a little more about that in the next Andrew Lloyd Webber show that I talk about. A Little Night Music is another show that has weird and kind of, potentially inappropriate, actually definitely inappropriate relationships. But the difference between A Little Night Music and Aspects of Love is the score is so good in A Little Night Music. That and I haven't seen Aspects of Love live, but I get the impression it's meant to be played straight. And A Little Night Music is definitely supposed to be a comedy that demonstrates how, messed up the relationships are. And also the fact that everybody ends up with a better suited partner at the end. But no, Little Night Music just has a fantastic score. It uses the waltz a lot. And this is really interesting because traditionally a waltz represents love and romance or maybe nostalgia. In A Little Night Music, whenever the waltz is used, a character is either contemplating or working on leaving their partner for someone else. So it's an interesting little subversion of the traditional use of the waltz. There are so many songs that I think are just fantastic in A Little Night Music. From The Sun Won't Set to The Miller's Son, it's really hard to pick a favorite. Sunset Boulevard is the next show that I'm going to talk about for Andrew Lloyd Webber. And this is where I'm going to get back into the dialogue being sung. Just like with Aspects of Love, Sunset Boulevard it's largely sung through musical, but the dialogue that's being sung just feels wrong when it's sung. A lot of sung through musicals fall into this trap where they're singing things they shouldn't be singing just for the sake of singing them. And Sunset Boulevard definitely feels like one of those musicals. I really love Barbra Streisand's renditions of With One Look and As If We Never Said Goodbye. Those are just fantastic songs when she sings them. Other than that, though, I'm not really a big fan of Sunset Boulevard. I generally prefer the Glenn Close version to the Patti LuPone version, even though I'm a huge Patti LuPone fan. But for whatever reason, I think that Glenn Close's rendition of these songs just worked out better. But again, Barbra Streisand is my preferred singer for these songs. The next Sondheim show I'm going to talk about is Pacific Overtures. This is a less-known show. It's often called Sondheim's most ambitious project because it's written in this sort of quasi-Japanese style. And it has some really interesting lyrics, some fun rhymes like tranquil and tranquil. But it's definitely not one of my favorite Sondheim shows. It didn't really stick with me. I haven't seen it live yet. I've only listened to the cast album once or twice. But it just didn't really do much for me. The song that stood out to me the most and made it into my playlist is For Black Dragons. But in general, not my favorite Sondheim score. Although I do plan to revisit it and see if it sticks with me a little later. By Jeeves is one of Andrew Lloyd Webber's least successful musicals. It's a fun show. It's it has some fun songs in it. I love the character of Jeeves. He's the butler character. And he's got this really stoic deadpan that is just fantastic. The show does feel overly long, but there are several really good numbers in it. My favorite being What Have You Got to Say, Jeeves, where Jeeves has a rare but delightful singing part. Sweeney Todd is one of Sondheim's most famous and most loved shows. And it is one of my favorites. It's really interesting in how it sets up a reasonable revenge story that just goes off the rails. And it asks you, how much can you sympathize with Sweeney Todd? Because it starts off with a revenge story that everybody wants to see play out positively for Todd. But then, as he descends deeper into madness and villainy, it starts to beg the question of how okay is this, right? At what point do you stop rooting for Sweeney Todd? The score from Sweeney Todd is absolutely fantastic. There's so many great songs from it. I think my favorite is the Ballad of Sweeney Todd. If anything, just for the three syllable rhymes like machiny, or multiple syllable rhymes like Sweeney planned and Machini planned. But no, there's really a bunch of fantastic songs in that show. The last Andrew Lloyd Webber show that I'm going to talk about is Love Never Dies, which is the sequel to Phantom of the Opera. It feels like a bad fan fiction with a really good score. I've often wondered whether it was just Andrew Lloyd Webber's excuse to write a big sweeping score like Phantom again. If it wasn't tied to Phantom, it would actually be a decent show. There's some parts of it that are still, cringy, but it would have been a lot better of a show if it had not been tied to Phantom of the Opera, because of how much it just sort of butchers the characters from Phantom of the Opera. It does have some really good songs, including the title song, which that one's interesting because you can just tell how significant that one is to Andrew Lloyd Webber. In the sense that he's been using that song for years, decades. You can hear from, I think it was the Andrew Lloyd Webber 50th birthday concert, Kiri Tekanawa sings a song called The Heart Will Never Learn. No, The Heart is Slow to Learn. And it's the same tune as Love Never Dies. And then again, in another musical that we haven't talked about today called The Beautiful Game, you get that same tune with different lyrics again. And then finally, it settles down in Love Never Dies as the title song. So that's just really interesting. And ultimately, it's heavily inspired by a Puccini aria. Anyway, my favorite song from Love Never Dies is Till I Hear You Sing, which is the opening number. The next Sondheim show that I'm going to talk about is Sunday in the Park with George. Many consider this to be Sondheim's magnum opus. I believe Sondheim himself considered it to be as well. And it is just a fascinating musical. It's about the obsession of the artist and how that impacts relationships. And it's just a really, really interesting dive into things like obsession and passion and stuff like that. It's really fascinating. There's a lot of fantastic quotes that come from it. As a lyricist myself, one of my favorite quotes of all time is, "Everything you do, let it come from you, then it will be new. Give us more to see," from the song Move On in the second act. That's a really fantastic quote to repeat to yourself when you're concerned about whether your work will be original or not. It tells you that, as long as you put your own perspective into it, there will be that originality that is necessary for art. There's many really good songs from the show, including Move On and Sunday, and several other shows. My favorite, personally, is Putting It Together. I just like the rhymes in it. Into the Woods is probably Sondheim's most popular show, which is kind of funny to me because it's not even in my top 5 Sondheim shows. It's a good show. I just feel like coming off the high of Sunday in the Park with George, it's a little lacking. There's a lot of really good songs in it. There's a lot of catchy songs in it. I love Bernadette Peters as the witch in the original Broadway performance or production. But in the most recent revival, Joshua Henry really steals the show as Rapunzel's prince. He really made me wish that Rapunzel's prince had a much larger role, because, quite frankly, Joshua Henry is deserving of a much larger role in that show. My favorite song is On the Steps of the Palace. I love the alliteration and the para-rhymes that you see in it. Assassins is another Sondheim show that resembles Sweeney Todd in a way, thematically. I like to think of it as Sweeney Todd meets Hamilton meets Cats. In the sense, that's a really funny way of saying it, but in the sense that it takes these real figures, which were the presidential assassins, and they all take you through these scenes that show their ideology and their reasons for attempting or successfully assassinating a president. And at the same time, it always asks you, how much can you sympathize with these characters? It makes the characters remarkably sympathetic at times, which is just a weird experience because these are presidential assassins. And, but yeah, it's an interesting show. I would really love to see it live. I actually had the chance to see it live last year, but I missed it, and that was such a bummer. My favorite song is The Ballad of Cholgosh. It's a very catchy song. It's also fun to try to spell. And then the final musical that I'm going to talk about today is Passion, which is Sondheim's last Tony-winning musical, as far as best musicals, as last Tony Best Musical winner. And this one came out in the mid-90s, starring Donna Murphy and Marin Mazzie, and that was a really good cast. Passion is a really interesting show. It's one that I feel like I don't know as well as I would like to know, because it's just really interesting in how it discusses and portrays romantic love and obsession and manipulation. Passion is a fantastic example of how Sondheim wrote emotions and relationships like nobody else. The depth and the angles that he took to portray these relationships and these emotions is really just fascinating. There's actually 2 pro shots of Passion, which is really rare. There's the one with the original Broadway cast, and then there's one with the Lincoln Center cast in 2005, with Patti LuPone as Fosca, Audra McDonald as Clara, and Michael Cerveris as Georgia. That was a really great cast as well. So I definitely recommend checking out one of the 2 pro shots that it has, because those are really good. My favorite song from Passion is No One Has Ever Loved Me. Anyway, if you've made it this far into this essay on Sondheim and Andrew Lloyd Webber shows, which I hope you have, I hope you enjoyed it. I will try to fill out my knowledge of Andrew Lloyd Webber shows and Sondheim shows, mostly Lloyd Webber shows, before next year's birthday, because I was actually surprised at how few Lloyd Webber shows I know compared to Sondheim shows, even though I've listened to over half of his shows. But let me know in the comments what your favorite Sondheim and Lloyd Webber shows are, and if you're going to join me in the double feature for their birthday, which shows you plan on watching.